Montana Territory, 1876. The wind snapped sharp across the open field, lifting skirts and hats alike as Florence Newton stood frozen in front of the gathered crowd outside the church in Red Hollow. Her heart pounded like a trapped bird against her ribs. She could still hear the words, even though he had already turned his back and walked away. "You are too ugly to be my wife," Charles Dobbins had said, loud enough for every soul in town to hear. Gasps had rippled through the crowd. Florence just stood there, clutching the small bouquet of wildflowers in trembling hands, the white of her dress looking foolishly bright against the dirt road. Her father's face was tight with rage, her mother's eyes brimmed with tears. The preacher, poor old Reverend Wallace, closed the Bible with a heavy sigh. Charles did not look back. He mounted up and rode off down the road, leaving Florence humiliated and hollowed out in front of everyone she had known her whole life. The seconds stretched long and cruel. Someone shifted uncomfortably. A cough. A whispered prayer. Florence's throat burned, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. And then, cutting through the thick silence, came the sound of boots on the wood steps. Steady, certain. Florence blinked back the sting in her eyes and turned her head just enough to see who it was. Yates Zimmerman. He was a cowboy who had drifted into Red Hollow 6 months ago, working cattle for the Barrett Ranch outside town. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled at the edges of his hat and a rough kindness in his brown eyes. Florence had noticed him before, but only in passing. A nod here. A polite good morning there. Now he was climbing the steps right to her. Without hesitation, without a glance at the murmuring crowd, he dropped to one knee in front of her, the world tilted. "Florence Newton," Yates said, his voice low but firm, "I reckon Charles is a fool. If you will have me, I would be honored to be your husband." A stunned hush fell over everyone. Florence stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. His hand was outstretched, palm up, steady as stone. He meant it. He was serious. Her heart ached so deep in her chest it scared her. She was supposed to be heartbroken. She was supposed to be humiliated. But instead, she felt something warm start to burn inside her, something fierce and real. Florence looked at his hand. Then at his face. He was not looking through her or past her. He was looking right at her, like she was the only thing that mattered. Her fingers shook as she set the crushed bouquet aside and placed her hand in his. A slow, sure smile touched Yates' mouth and he rose to his feet, pulling her gently up with him. Reverend Wallace cleared his throat, his voice a little wobbly. "Well, if you both are willing." "I suppose we might continue." Florence could not find her voice. She just nodded, her hand still in Yates', gripping it like a lifeline. The crowd shifted, stunned but curious. Yates squeezed her hand and leaned in just a little. "You are beautiful, Florence," he whispered, so only she could hear. "Always have been." Her throat tightened so hard she thought she might choke on it. She blinked fast, willing herself not to cry. The ceremony was a blur. She heard the words, repeated them when she had to, but it was all drowned out by the roar in her ears and the pounding of her heart. When Yates slipped a simple silver ring onto her finger, his touch was warm and solid. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Wallace said, a little unsteady but smiling now. Yates hesitated just a second, giving her the chance to pull away if she wanted, but Florence did not want to. Not at all. She lifted her chin and Yates bent his head and kissed her, slow and sure. The crowd erupted into surprised cheers and clapping. Someone whistled. Someone else hollered. Florence barely heard them. She clung to Yates, her fingers curling into the rough fabric of his shirt. His arms came around her, holding her close, steadying her when everything else felt like it might fall apart. When they finally broke apart, Yates touched his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I got you," he murmured. Florence closed her eyes for a moment and let herself believe it. He had her. And she had him. The sun broke through the clouds then, warm and golden, spilling down over the church steps and the dirt road and the wild fields beyond. Florence looked up at Yates, her new husband, and for the first time that day she smiled. Really smiled. Maybe everything she thought she wanted had just fallen apart, but maybe, just maybe, she had found something better. The sun was dipping low when Florence and Yates left the churchyard, walking side by side down the dusty road. Neither spoke for a while. The weight of what had happened pressed against them, but not in a way that felt heavy. It was more like the hush after a storm where the world holds its breath. Florence kept her gaze ahead, the hem of her dress brushing against her boots. She had no idea where they should go or what came next. Her parents had slipped away into the crowd after the ceremony, her mother dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, her father stiff and silent. No one had offered to host a gathering, no one had even thought to. "I got a cabin," Yates said finally, voice quiet but sure. "About 6 miles west near the river bend, ain't much but it's dry and warm." Florence glanced at him. His hat shaded his face, but she caught the steady line of his jaw. "I'd like to see it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded once. "I got a wagon hitched round back. We can take it." They circled behind the church, finding his weather-worn wagon waiting. A pair of bay horses, strong but a little shaggy from winter, stood patiently in the traces. Yates helped her up with a hand at her waist, warm, respectful, no hesitation. She settled onto the wooden bench, smoothing her skirt absently as he climbed up beside her. The wheels creaked as they rolled out of Red Hollow. Florence looked back only once. The town was already folding itself back into its routines, children chasing each other past the mercantile, smoke curling from chimneys. No one watched them leave. The land opened up as they moved west, the prairie grasses rippling under the evening breeze. Hawks hung suspended in the wide sky, and a few cattle dotted the far hills. Florence breathed deeper, the scent of sage and dust curling in her nose, grounding her. After a long stretch of quiet, Yates cleared his throat. "I know it wasn't what you planned," he said, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. "I reckon you deserved better than what happened today." Florence folded her hands in her lap, feeling the roughness of her wedding band against her thumb. "Maybe. But I'm not sorry." He tipped his head slightly toward her, still not looking full on. "You ain't," she shook her head. "I don't believe I ever loved Charles. I think I loved the idea of a future, a safe one." The horse's hooves clopped steadily against the dirt. Yates said nothing for a moment, then asked, "And now?" Florence traced a knot in the bench with her fingertip. "Now, I think, I'm ready to build something real, even if it's not what I pictured." He let out a breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "You're stronger than most folks I know." They rode on, the silence between them growing easier, less stiff. As twilight deepened, Yates pointed to a stand of cottonwoods ahead. "That's the river. My place is just beyond." The land dipped gently, and soon Florence saw a small cabin tucked among the trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a rough, fenced corral sat off to one side with a dun mare grazing inside. The roof was patched in places and the porch sagged a little, but the windows glowed with warm light. Yates pulled up the team and hopped down, tying the horses to a post. He offered his hand again without a word. She took it, feeling the calluses against her skin. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A stone hearth took up one wall with a fire crackling low. A table and 2 chairs sat under the window, a shelf with a few battered books above it. A small bed, neatly made, filled the corner opposite. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something faintly sweet, maybe dried apples. Yates shrugged out of his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. He moved around the cabin with easy familiarity, lighting a pair of oil lamps and setting a kettle on the hearth to heat. Florence stood near the door, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. "You hungry?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. She realized she was, though she hadn't noticed until now. "A little," he nodded. "Ain't much, but I got stew left from this morning. Should still be good." As he ladled the stew into 2 bowls, Florence moved to the small shelf and ran her fingers lightly over the spines of the books. She found a Bible, a volume of Whitman's poetry, and a well-worn treatise on horse doctoring. "You read poetry?" she asked, surprised. Yates chuckled low in his throat. "Some when the nights get long." He set a bowl at the table and pulled out a chair for her. She sat, smoothing her skirts again out of habit more than need. They ate quietly, the fire popping softly behind them. The stew was hearty venison, carrots, a few potatoes. Florence hadn't tasted anything so good in months. When they finished, Yates cleared the bowls and set them by the basin. He turned back to her, his face unreadable for a moment. "I ain't gonna rush you, Florence," he said. "This marriage. It can be what you need it to be. You got my word." Her chest tightened at the gentleness in his voice. No demands, no expectations, just a quiet offering of steadiness. She rose from her chair, smoothing her palms against her skirt. "I married you because I wanted to," she said, meeting his gaze fully. "Not because I was afraid to be alone." He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. "Then we start from there," he said. Florence smiled, small but sure. "From there." Outside, the stars were beginning to prick through the velvet sky, the first signs of a night that would be cold but clear. Inside the cabin, with the fire burning low and Yates standing steady beside her, Florence felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. They had begun something, she realized, not out of desperation, not out of pity, but out of choice. Florence woke to the soft hush of rain pattering against the cabin roof. For a moment, she lay still beneath the heavy quilt, the warmth of the small room wrapping around her like a second skin. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light across the floorboards. She turned her head slightly. Yates sat at the table, whittling a piece of wood with slow, careful strokes. His boots were off, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was a quiet concentration in the set of his shoulders. Her heart gave a small, uncertain flutter. She had married a man she barely knew, and yet there was no fear in her chest, only a strange, steady calm. "You always wake up this early?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. He looked over, a faint crease near his eye deepening as he smiled. "Most mornings. Cattle don't wait for a man to get his rest." Florence pushed back the quilt and swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cool floor. She crossed to the hearth, tossing a few small logs onto the embers until the fire caught again. The warmth spread fast, chasing away the lingering chill. "What are you making?" she asked, glancing at the slender piece of wood in his hands. "Just a spoon," Yates said. "Lost one last week. Figured I'd whittle another stead of spending coin." She nodded, watching the fine curls of wood fall to the table. There was something comforting about the simple, steady movements of his hands. After a pause, she said, "I don't know much about mending or tending stock. I can sow some, cook a little, but my life's been more about keeping house than working land." Yates set down the carving knife and leaned back in his chair, studying her with a thoughtful look. "You willing to learn?" he asked. She pressed her palms to the front of her skirt. "I am." "That's all that matters," he said. "Everything else we figure out together." Florence let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The rain softened against the roof, turning into a gentle mist. "Come spring," Yates said, "I plan to fence a few more acres, maybe plant some corn and beans if the ground's right." "I can help with that," she said quickly. He nodded. "I know you can." They shared a quiet moment, the fire crackling, the rain whispering against the wood. Florence felt a small, fierce pride kindle inside her. She had not been chosen out of pity. She had been chosen because he saw something in her worth standing beside. "I'll need to fetch more seed," he said, shifting his gaze to the window. "Maybe next week ride into Helena. It's a long haul, be gone near 5 days." Florence's stomach twisted a little at the thought of him leaving, but she straightened her shoulders. "I can tend things here." "You won't be alone," he said. "My neighbor, Mrs. Langtry, lives a mile west. She looks out for folks. I'll make sure she knows." Florence felt the knot of worry ease. "Thank you." He rose from the chair, stretching his arms overhead until his spine popped. Then he crossed to the hearth, crouching to adjust the logs. "Florence," he said without looking up, "you ever think about what you want? Past what other folks expect?" She blinked, caught off guard by the question. She knelt beside him, feeding a small stick into the flames. "I don't know if I ever let myself," she admitted. "I was too busy trying to fit into the life everyone said I should want." Yates tossed a larger piece of wood onto the fire, the flames leaping higher. "Well," he said, This land's wide enough that you can make a life any way you please." She turned to him, the firelight catching the side of his face, highlighting the strong line of his cheekbone and the soft curve of his mouth. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you want?" He sat back on his heels, considering. "A place that's mine. A woman who chooses to stand with me, not because she has to, but because she wants to. A life that's honest." Florence reached for his hand without thinking, her fingers curling around his. "I reckon," she said quietly, "we want the same thing." His thumb brushed over the back of her hand, slow and sure. "Then we're off to a good start," he said. Florence smiled, a real one this time, deep in her bones. The rain tapered off, leaving the world outside washed clean and new. Inside the cabin, with the fire warm and Yates' hand steady in hers, Florence felt something settle inside her for the first time in her life. She was home. By the time afternoon stretched long and golden over the prairie, Florence had helped Yates mend the broken hinge on the corral gate and stack a fresh pile of split wood near the cabin. Her hands ached and her skirts were dust-streaked, but there was a satisfaction in the honest work that she hadn't known she was missing. Yates wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, leaving a smear of dust. He looked toward the hills where a line of dark clouds gathered like a warning. "Storm's coming," he said. "We best gather the chickens." Florence raised an eyebrow. "You have chickens?" "6 hens and a mean old rooster named Barlow," he said, reaching for a battered straw hat hanging from a nail. "You'll know him when you see him." Following him across the yard, Florence caught sight of a small coop tucked under a lean-to. As they approached, the hens clucked and scattered, and sure enough, a tall, scraggly rooster strutted out, flaring his wings like a challenge. "That's Barlow?" she asked, laughing despite herself. Yates nodded solemnly. "He thinks he owns the place." They worked side by side, herding the birds into the coop as the wind picked up, lifting the scent of wet earth into the air. Barlow pecked at Yates' boots, earning a low grunt. "Reckon he don't like me much," Yates muttered. Florence knelt to scoop up a struggling hen, tucking it against her body. "Maybe he's jealous." Yates chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound that curled into her chest. "He's got good reason." The words slipped out so easily that Florence felt her cheeks warm under the brim of her bonnet. She ducked her head, pretending to fuss with the latch on the coop. As they finished, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, darkening the dust. They sprinted back to the cabin, laughing breathlessly as they slammed the door against the wind. Inside, the room filled with the smell of rain and clean earth. Florence leaned against the wall, catching her breath. Yates shook the water from his hat and hung it on its peg. "Think that rooster's still cursing me," he said, raking a hand through his damp hair. Florence smiled, then hesitated. She traced the wood grain of the door with her fingertips, gathering her courage. "I ought to write my folks," she said. "Let them know I'm well." Yates nodded, his expression open. "You want me to take it along when I ride to Helena," she considered. "If you don't mind." "Never mind doing a thing for you," he said simply. Something eased inside her. She crossed to the table and pulled out a folded piece of paper from her reticule, setting it down carefully. "I'll write it tonight," she said. "After supper." Yates stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. He didn't crowd her, just stood there, solid and patient. "You miss them?" he asked. She thought about it, surprised at how hard the answer was to find. "I miss what I thought we were," she said, "but I don't miss feeling like I'm never enough." Yates' hand brushed hers, light as a whisper. "You are enough," he said. The clock above the hearth ticked steady and slow. Florence turned her hand over, her palm meeting his. His fingers closed around hers, steady and sure. Outside, the rain hammered against the roof, but inside, the cabin was warm and still. Florence looked up at him, and the space between them seemed to vanish without either of them moving. "I never thought I'd be glad for a broken wedding," she said softly. His thumb traced a slow circle against her wrist. "Sometimes," Yates said, his voice low, "the good things come after the hurt." She leaned into him then, resting her forehead against his shoulder. His arms came around her, drawing her close. This was no grand declaration, no sweeping promise. Just a man and a woman holding on to each other while the storm passed over. And Florence, for the first time in her life, felt wholly, quietly loved. The storm rolled out by morning, leaving the earth damp and shining under a pale sun. Florence stood at the threshold of the cabin, breathing in the crisp air that smelled of wet sage and new beginnings. Behind her, Yates tightened the saddle cinch on his bay gelding, preparing for the ride into Helena. She handed him a small, folded letter, sealed with a bit of wax. "For my parents," she said, "if you find them willing to read it." Yates tucked it carefully into an oilskin pouch. "I'll make sure it reaches them, come what may." Florence reached up, adjusting the collar of his coat with careful fingers. "Ride safe," she said, feeling the words catch in her throat. He covered her hand with his. "I'll be back before you miss me too much." "I'll miss you before you leave," she said, managing a small smile. He kissed her forehead, lingering just a moment longer than he usually allowed himself, then swung into the saddle. She watched him ride out, his figure growing smaller against the wide, open land until he disappeared over the rise. The days that followed moved slower without him. Florence kept busy, patching a tear in the quilt, mending a cracked bucket handle and baking her first loaf of bread in the hearth oven. When Barlow crowed each morning, she gathered eggs with steady hands, mumbling a good-natured warning to the rooster as he strutted nearby. "Mrs." Langtry rode over on the second day, bringing a jar of blackberry preserves and a sharp eye that missed nothing. "Yates told me you'd be here," the older woman said, dismounting with a grunt. "Said you had good sense." Florence invited her in, pouring strong coffee and listening as Mrs. Langtry shared news of the neighboring homesteads. The Langtrys had lost a son in the war, she said, and the land had become the last thing tying her to the world. "Land don't leave you," Mrs. Langtry said, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "Neither does the right kind of man." Florence thought of Yates, steady and kind, and nodded without speaking. On the fourth morning, Florence rose early and fed the horses before the sky had fully lightened. As she brushed the dun mare, a flash of movement caught her eye along the road. A horse and rider approached, the figure slouched in the saddle but unmistakable. She dropped the brush and ran, skirts tangling around her boots. Yates pulled up short as she reached him, dismounting stiffly. His coat was dusted with trail dirt, and a fresh scrape ran along his cheekbone, but his smile was bright and easy. "Miss me?" he asked, voice rough from days of riding. Without answering, Florence threw her arms around him, feeling the solid weight of him against her chest. He hugged her back tightly, one hand cradling the back of her head like she might shatter if he let go too soon. "I brought you something," he said after a moment, pulling a small cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebag. Inside was a bolt of calico fabric, soft blue with tiny white flowers. "Figured you might want a new dress," he said a little shyly. Florence traced the pattern with her fingertips, heart swelling so full it hurt. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "And this," he added, pulling a small book from the saddlebag. It was a slim volume, worn at the edges Emerson's collected essays. "I saw it and thought of you," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Florence clutched the gifts to her chest, blinking fast. "Thank you, Yates, for seeing me." He smiled in that quiet way of his, and she knew she was truly home. That evening, after the horses were settled and supper eaten, they sat together on the porch. The sun sank low, setting the sky ablaze with colors that rippled across the river bend. Florence leaned her head against Yates' shoulder. "Did my parents send any word?" she asked, voice soft. He hesitated, then said, "Your mother sent a note, said she was glad you were safe, said she hoped you found happiness." Florence closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deep. "I have," she said. Yates kissed the top of her head. "Me too." The days turned warmer after that. They planted corn and beans in the freshly fenced pasture, working side by side under the wide Montana sky. Florence stitched a new dress from the blue calico, wearing it proudly the day Yates made a new table for the cabin, the wood polished and smooth beneath her hands. In late summer, Yates built a second room onto the cabin, hammering and sawing with steady determination. Florence helped where she could, laughing when they both ended up covered in sawdust. When the room was finished, it stood ready for the family they both hoped to build someday. One evening, as the first crispness of autumn touched the air, Florence sat by the fire, sewing a quilt from old scraps. Yates read aloud from the Emerson book, his voice low and steady, filling the room with words about self-reliance and quiet courage. As he read, Florence looked around the cabin, the sturdy walls, the flickering fire, the little shelf of worn books. The man she loved seated across from her, and felt a deep, unshakable peace settle into her bones. She had built a life, not the one she had once imagined, but the one she had chosen. And she would choose it again, every single day years later, when their children asked how their parents had fallen in love. Florence would tell them about the day a stranger knelt before her on a dusty church step with the whole town watching. About the man who saw her when others would not, and the life they built with their own hands. And Yates, smiling across the dinner table, would add simply, "Sometimes the best things come when you least expect them." Their homestead grew strong around them, rooted deep into the Montana soil. And so did their love, quiet, steadfast, and enduring as the land itself.